Welcome to our sixth session, this one about paternalism and state neutrality. Now, when we're doing political philosophy, we may be asking very general, very big questions about the state. We may be asking questions about whether and when a state is legitimate at all. When does it have legitimate authority? When is it okay for it to use force, indeed to monopolize force? These are very interesting and big questions, but we're just going to set them to one side for now. We're going to be focusing on questions that are, as it were, further down the road. So we're going to be assuming a legitimate, roughly decent state. It doesn't have to be perfect, of course, no state is, but it has to be legitimate. It passes whatever minimum bar there is for state legitimacy and for legitimate authority. Still, even with a legitimate state, questions arise about the scope of its legitimate authority. And this is perhaps an insight often attributed to John Stuart Mill, that's him right there, that we want to have some restrictions, some normative restrictions on the actions of even a legitimate state. There are upper bounds to what a legitimate state can permissibly do. So, for instance, you may think of human rights as precisely serving this function. You may think that human rights, perhaps encoded in such constitutional phrases as Congress shall make no law that will in effect violate such a right. Human rights pose a constraint on what even a legitimate state can permissibly do. But human rights are not the only plausible constraint here. There are others. For instance, you may think of something like Mill's harm principle precisely along these lines. This is roughly the principle that says that the state should only be allowed to use its force, is only authorized to use its force in order to prevent one person from causing harm to another. If anything like the harm principle can be defended, then it poses another restriction on what a legitimate state can permissibly do. And there may be other ones that get us closer to today's topics. For instance, you may think that the state is never allowed to paternalize its citizens or to interfere in a paternalistic way with its citizens' actions and behaviors. Or you may go for a weaker version thereof. You may think that at least for some very important not negligible subset of cases, the state is not allowed to paternalize its citizens. Similarly, you may think that the state should be neutral, as we will say later on, with regard to the question of a good life. Perhaps the state should not have an official answer, an official view on what makes a life go better. And if so, perhaps the state, even a legitimate state, should never interfere in ways that would rely on a view about what makes a life go better. So, as you will realize by now, this is a common thread in this course. We don't care about definitions, not, for instance, about definitions of paternalism or neutrality. What we care about, as always, are the underlying moral or other normative intuitions, the concerns to which such terms are supposed to be a part of their response. And so at least one plausible way into the debate is going to be via examples, because we do have intuitions about examples more than about abstract terms, certainly terms of art. So let's mention some examples. Now, before we go through the examples, these are going to be purported examples of paternalistic interventions. But it must be realized that all of these examples, certainly most of them, I suspect all of them, are the potential locus of controversy, because everything is controversial, at least potentially. So for each one of these cases, you can probably find a thinker who is not going to be happy to classify them as a paternalistic intervention, or you may be able to think of a set of circumstances that will make it no longer clear that it's a case of paternalism. I suggest we just hold off such doubts for a while. Let's just bring the examples, have a view of them that will let us understand at least what is roughly meant by paternalism, and the more precise discussion will follow. Then, with the more precise discussion at hand, we can return to the examples, we can revisit them, and see whether we want to revise the classification of some of them as cases of paternalism. So some cases of paternalism come from the criminal law. For instance, in many jurisdictions, it is a violation of criminal law. Traffic laws are an instance of criminal law. So it is a violation of criminal law to ride a motorcycle without a helmet. Not, of course, in all jurisdictions, but in many. Arguably, the main rationale for such a prohibition is to defend the motorcycle rider, him or herself, rather than society or anyone they will hurt. Right? The main function of the helmet is to help protect the rider's brain in a case of an accident, no one else's. So this looks like a paternalistic intervention. We restrict the liberty of the motorcycle rider in order to defend him or herself. And there are many other cases. Perhaps especially puzzling one is that in many jurisdictions, it still is the case, and I think in the common law it always used to be the case, that suicide is a criminal offense. Who is protected by the offense against suicide? So at least arguably, it's the person who commits the offense, him or herself. Of course, if they succeed, then there is no one left to protect. But there may be a rationale for prohibitions on suicide that's based on other peripheral kind of offenses, attempted suicide, perhaps physician-assisted suicide, and so on. But anyway, assuming that these two are meant primarily to protect the person who considers committing suicide, him or herself, then these are also cases of paternalistic intervention encoded in the criminal law. But it will be a mistake to think that the criminal law is the only place, even just the only legal place, where we can see cases of paternalism. So here are a few other examples. For instance, you may want to tax cigarettes. Now, so far, it's not that interesting. We tax everything. Why not cigarettes? But you may want to say, look, cigarettes are extremely unhealthy. So we may want to tax them extra high. Suppose you have, I don't know, a certain kind of taxation on broccoli, which is good for you. We may want to have double as high the taxation or triple as high the taxation for cigarettes because they're not good for you. Now, this is not a matter of the criminal law exactly, right? It's taxation. But still, it is a case of paternalism because at least arguably, and again, complications can arise here, but at least arguably, the person who's, or the rationale for such higher taxation on cigarettes is to protect the smoker from her or his own poor judgment or weakness of will. You may think about some parts of labor law. At least in some jurisdictions, there are parts of labor law that are cogent, that are not such that the worker, him or herself, do not have the normative power to give up some of these rights. There are known or inalienable labor rights. And you may think that the rationale for some of those is to protect the worker. And if so, at least one way of understanding them is as cases of paternalism. But again, here, things may depend on the details of the specific legal arrangements. So far, we had legal cases, right? Some in the criminal law, some outside the criminal law. There are what we may think of as more broadly political cases that are not exactly legal. For instance, and what I mean by not legal here is not illegal, of course, but not via the law. The main mechanism is not the law. So suppose we want to subsidize what is sometimes referred to as high culture. We want to subsidize our opera house. Why would we do that? Presumably because opera is of value. Well, but if it's of such great value, why don't people just buy tickets, as expensive as they need to be, without any public subsidy? So you may think that it's actually better for people than they realize that there be an opera house. Either that it's better for the people who may go to the opera if the tickets are cheaper, or it may be a kind of a public good. It may be good for everyone to live in a society in which high culture prospers. At least one way of understanding such subsidies is along paternalistic lines. We are helping those who would not help themselves by buying a non-subsidized ticket. So that's one way of viewing that. Similarly, and this is going to be the opposite case of the contrary case of having a high taxation on cigarettes, you may have a kind of a normal baseline taxation on broccoli, although it's really unclear what such a baseline consists in. But you may want to have a negative taxation on broccoli because it's just so good for you. So you may want to incentivize people to have more broccoli. One way of doing that would be to subsidize, right? That's negative taxation, to subsidize broccoli. And at least one way of understanding why that may be a good idea is because it's a way of helping people to do what's better for them anyway, and what they would not have done without our help. So maybe some people will have broccoli at the subsidized price, but not at the non-subsidized price. This may also be seen as a kind of political paternalism, even if not via the law directly. There are even non-political versions of paternalism. Some of them are still institutional, but not quite political, certainly not involving the state. For instance, at the university, at our faculty of law, there may be rules stating an upper bound to how many courses a student may be registered to in a specific term. There may be many rationales for such a restriction, but at least one possible rationale is to protect the student from her or his own expected errors of judgment. People tend to think they can do more than they actually can, and we have nice empirical evidence of that over the years, so we may want to protect our students from committing these mistakes. If so, this restriction will be paternalistic, institutionalized, right? It's a part of our faculty of law practices. It's not a part of personal relations, but it's not via the state, certainly not via the law. Then, of course, there are cases of paternalism that are not institutional at all. So the cases from which the term arises are cases of the relations between parents and children. So very often, certainly with young children, one of the roles of the parents is to protect the kids from their own poor judgment or other practical failures. Again, that's very standard. You won't let your child have as much chocolate as she wants because she's not very good at restricting herself on these things. That would be paternalistic. But it doesn't have to be about kids. Sometimes my wife will try not to let me have as much chocolate as I want because I'm not that good when it comes to strength of will and good chocolate. Now, maybe she can't prohibit that in the same kind of way in which we can when it involves our young children, but she can do other things. For instance, she can hide the chocolate around our place. And if she's good enough at doing that, then in effect, I will be prevented from having too much chocolate. What would be her rationale? Well, that depends on the case. Obviously, if she just wants to keep enough of it for herself, then her intervention is not plausibly considered paternalistic. But if she does it just because she cares about my health, and she knows, as she does, that I will not be sufficiently good, sufficiently practical, rational in promoting my health in such cases, then it seems like her hiding the chocolate from me is a case of paternalism. So we have a bunch of examples in front of us, and I take it they at least are good enough to give us a feel for what it is that we're talking about. And these examples come from the criminal law, from elsewhere in the law, from elsewhere in politics, from other institutional settings, and also from non-institutional personal relationships. I want to mention another kind of a case, or anyway what may be plausibly considered another kind of a case, which has been getting a lot of attention recently, rightly, I think, in the literature, both the philosophical and the political and the legal and indeed the popular. And this is the case that you may have heard of under the term nudge. The starting point for these discussions, the starting point is acknowledging that we suffer from any number of cognitive biases and related phenomena. The pioneering work on cognitive biases was by Kahneman and Tversky. This is Tversky's picture right there. The natural thought here is just the following. We are not perfectly rational. Okay, that's not news, right? You don't get a Nobel Prize for that. But here's a more interesting point. It's not just that we are not fully rational, but that our irrationalities or our imperfections have a systematic nature, and so they can be predicted, at least to an extent. And if they can be predicted, there is a lot of stuff we can do with them. We can understand better human behavior. Perhaps we can engineer our institutions better. We can also take advantage of people's entirely predictable failures of rationality. Now, this is a very, very quick and imprecise understanding of cognitive biases and perhaps other biases and failures as well. But again, the crucial point is that they're not erratic. There's a systematic thing going on, and so a predictable thing going on. So, for instance, suppose we find out that when people choose what to buy, say, in your shop or in a cafeteria, they are not merely taking into account the rationally relevant considerations, like how much it costs and what its virtues are. Maybe it's a camera or whatever. But if you want to know what will causally determine their choices, you're going to have to take into account other factors as well, including factors that are not reason-given, that don't make normative sense. But still, we can predict that people will be influenced by them. For instance, people will be influenced by the geographic location of different items. So if you put different cameras with different abilities and different prices, at your display cabinet, the question which camera will people buy, or the distribution of people's preferences as between the cameras, will be at least partly sensitive to where they are in the cabinet. Now, that seems like a design flaw in humans, right? You wouldn't want that if you, in yourself, for instance, or in someone else. But still, as it happens, that does influence people in predictable ways. For one thing, they tend to go more often to things that are roughly in the same height as their eyes. Whether this is good or bad kind of depends on your point of view here, right? Suppose you are the shop owner. If you know this thing, if you know that this kind of factor will have an effect on people's choices, that's something that's of value to you, because you can now manipulate people's choices in ways that rely on it. And it's not even clear that that's wrong. You are entitled to place things in your display cabinet whichever way you want, so long as you're not deceiving them, you're not coercing them, you're not manipulating them in other ways. It doesn't seem like there's necessarily anything wrong. Certainly there's no right violation. So it sort of feels a little problematic, although we are going to have to say more about how, if at all, it's problematic later on. It's not even clear that we want to discourage it, or that we want the state to discourage this kind of behavior, namely to discourage people taking advantage of other people's cognitive biases, but in ways that don't amount to a right violation in a more standard kind of sense. Again, we're going to return to this later on. But let's be more optimistic for a second. As we said, cognitive biases, other similar failures that are systematic and predictable, they allow someone to manipulate the choices of the relevant people. In the first case I mentioned, they allowed the shop owner to do it for their own profit. But maybe they can do it in another way. Maybe we can manipulate people's choices, preferences, actions in order to benefit them, rather than in order to harm them or benefit ourselves. So here's a standard example that the people who write about nudge, the most famous ones are Sunstein and Thaler in the book entitled Nudge. It's the case of the salad in the cafeteria. So we know that in the cafeteria, people tend to choose more the dishes that are at eye height. You are now responsible for the cafeteria, and you can put the French fries and the salads wherever you want, so long as both are accessible to your clients. What do we think about the person who puts the salad in the height, roughly in the height of the eyes, in order to make it the case that people eat more healthy? This is not a case of maximizing profit. This is a case of a kind of paternalistic intervention, right? It's for the people whom you are manipulating in a way. But the nature of the intervention is different. There doesn't seem to be a restriction on liberty. What's going on is that you sort of push them a little bit in the direction of the right choice by employing what we know about cognitive and other biases. This little push is what gives nudging its name. Here's another example. We have very strong empirical evidence that people are sort of biased towards the default. So you can offer them two options. It really matters which one is the default and whether they should opt in or opt out. There are many examples of this kind. Here's one. Suppose your default rule is that you can't collect organs from a dead body, say someone who died in an accident, unless they signed a certain document. So the default is no, but you can opt in by signing the document. And we can see how many people will actually sign the document, and the answers are depressingly low. Suppose you have a different kind of arrangement. On that arrangement, the default is that you are allowed to take organs from someone who died in an accident in order to save other people's lives for transplants. But people can opt out if they want. They just have to sign some document. And assume, by the way, that signing the documents is really hardly any practical trouble at all. Suppose when you fill in the forms for a driver's license or for renewing the driver's license, you just have to check another box. So there's no cost involved in opting in the first case or opting out in the second case. And we can again collect evidence. And as you can imagine, what will emerge is that the numbers differ. Seriously so. So when the default is that you can take organs from someone who died in an accident, very few people will sign the document in order to opt out. And when the default is that you can't, very few people will sign the document in order to opt in. Certainly these two numbers don't add up to the full population. That means that the default really matters. Well, we can set the default in ways that will benefit people. For instance, we know that people tend to strongly undersave for retirement if left to their own devices. There are many reasons for this. Weakness of will may be one, but it seems to be more serious than that. People tend to discount the future, certainly the distant future. Of course, if we let people undersave for retirement, certainly if we allow this on a massive scale, this will have terrible effects, terrible economic effects. So one thing you could do is just restrict their liberty. Take some of their money away and save it for them. That can be a good idea, but it is also problematic. It restricts their liberty. How about we go for the following then? We create a default scheme. The default scheme is going to be with the right kind of savings for retirement, but we're going to allow people to opt out. That seems like a good compromise when it comes to liberty. We no longer restrict their liberty as we would if we just took their money away and saved it for them. But it will be very effective because people won't opt out. Or anyway, most people won't, because most people are heavily biased towards sticking with the status quo or with a default. So if we go for such a default arrangement for retirement savings, we will be nudging them in the right direction. We're doing it in order to protect them, or everyone, us included, right? It's not necessarily about arrogance. I know that I too will tend to undersave for my retirement if left to my own devices. So we tend to protect everyone by manipulating in a gentle kind of way their cognitive and other biases. This is a case of nudging. Nudging is officially called sometimes libertarian paternalism for reasons that you can already see and we'll return to later. They seem to be cases of paternalism, but they also don't restrict liberty in the ways that many other cases of paternalism seem to do. Okay, so much for the examples, the sort of standard examples and the nudging kind of examples of paternalism. Perhaps now we can try to arrive at a, if not a definition, then at least something by way of a characterization of the phenomenon of paternalism. And I think there is a phenomenon here, a somewhat unified phenomenon. A good way of seeing that would be to see that all these cases that I've mentioned, they do seem to have something common to them. They don't seem to be just a pure list of cases. I think the intuitive idea is roughly the following. What happens in those cases is that we protect someone not from someone else, but from their own poor judgment or weakness of will or something of the sort. I think that's the crux of paternalism, an intervention that protects someone from their own failures. And it seems like doing so is at the very least morally suspicious. So obviously we're going to have to say more about that. Why is it, if at all, that paternalism is morally problematic? But at least at an initial level, the thought that we're protecting someone from their own poor judgment, that we are using maybe the state's force for that, that's at the very least morally suspicious. When I say morally suspicious, I mean, if you want to do that, you owe us a story. It requires justification. You have to say something why it's okay to protect someone from their own poor judgment. And if you want the state to do that, if you want political kind of paternalism and not just in interpersonal relations, then this requires even more clearly requires a justification. You may think, for instance, that that's just none of the state's business. Perhaps the state should not be in the business of protecting citizens from their own poor judgments or weakness of will. Maybe it should protect one person from the poor judgment, weakness of will, ill will of another. That's okay. That's like, if a state is ever justified, it's probably justified in order to do that. But you may think that that's it. You may think that the state is not also justified in protecting someone from their own failures. Of course, according to this understanding of paternalism, what makes a, say, a legal clause or regulation, what makes them paternalistic is not their content exactly. It's not their content, rather it's the reason or the rationale underlying the rule or the intervention. A way of seeing this is just to think about the examples again. So if I impose a very high taxation on cigarettes, but my rationale for this is to try and internalize the health-related costs of smoking, so that I'm going to have to actually hospitalize these people later on and treat them for lung cancer and so on. This includes tremendous costs. So maybe I need higher taxation on cigarettes just in order to be able to pay for all of these expenses. If that's my rationale, then the higher taxation on cigarettes is not a case of paternalism. It may be justified or unjustified, that will depend on the details, but the case of paternalism it isn't. What will make it a case of paternalism is if the rationale or the underlying motivation for the higher taxation on cigarettes is in order to protect the smoker or the potential smoker. Then the intervention is paternalistic. According to this understanding, if you are asked whether a certain kind of rule, intervention, whatever, is paternalistic, and all you are given is its content, your answer should always be, I don't know. It depends. Why are you subsidizing broccoli? Or why do you prohibit suicide or riding without a helmet? If you prohibit riding without a helmet because your neurosurgeons will not be able to treat all these people and all the other people who may suffer from brain damage, then you may be protecting the other people. Then it's not paternalism. But if you're doing it to protect the rider herself, then it is paternalistic. I want to acknowledge that there are going to be interesting borderline cases in which it's not clear whether we're talking about paternalism or not, and in which and cases about which at least some of the writers in the literature will disagree. So let's just give some of these examples. There are going to be cases of paternalistic intervention that don't involve exactly restriction on liberty. So the paradigmatic cases of restriction on liberty are the cases we started with, namely paternalistic cases involving the criminal law. But many of the other cases don't involve exactly restriction on liberty. And so if you think that a restriction on liberty is a necessary condition for paternalism, these are already going to be either non-paternalistic cases or maybe borderline cases or paternalistic cases. So again, subsidizing healthier food and maybe the case of nudging. There are also other borderline cases that are interesting here. So you may think, for instance, that we may sometimes intervene with people's actions and choices, not in order to protect their own well-being, but in order to protect, as it were, their moral status, or at least to make sure that they act rightly. So think about the example that I already gave of the difference between an opt-in and an opt-out arrangement when it comes to organ donation. Suppose that all of us have a duty to donate our organs or to do whatever is necessary so that if we die in a horrible accident, at least our organs will be able to be used to save others. Now, it won't improve my well-being that my organs are used after my death in certain ways. Or anyway, arguably, it won't. That may depend on intricate issues in the philosophy of well-being that are better put to one side for now. In that case, your intervention, say, by moving from an opt-in to an opt-out arrangement, thereby making the case that many, many more people will just do nothing, and so we will be able to use their organs. Your intervention is not in order to protect my own well-being from my poor judgment, but rather, well, it's not clear what it's for. It may be just in order to save other lives. Then there's nothing paternalistic going on, and that's fine. Then maybe the main rationale here. But you may think that there's more. The more is that we ought to sign a document under an opt-in arrangement. We ought to allow for our organs to be used in order to save lives after our death. And what the opt-out arrangement does is to make it more likely that we will behave as we ought to. So at least a part of the rationale for such an arrangement could be to protect not my well-being from my poor judgment, but my moral status. It's a way of making it much more likely that I will act as I ought to, without intervening in a way that restricts my liberty. So it's a kind of a nudging, but a moral nudging rather than a well-being nudging. Some people think that these cases are no longer cases of paternalism at all, because paternalism is essentially tied to the well-being of the paternalized. But we don't care about definitions, right? At least one thing that you may think of is that there's a kind of a breach of my sovereignty here. You still intervene with something that's in my area, or in the area in which I'm sovereign to make decisions for myself, even if it's not in order to save, to improve my own well-being. So Shana Schifrin, for instance, puts forward the characterization of paternalism that includes such cases as cases of paternalism because they involve an intrusion on one's sovereignty. I find the cases of self-paternalism really interesting, but some thinkers don't classify them as paternalism at all. So suppose that I make sure that there's no chocolate in the house. So it's now no longer my wife's decision. And perhaps what would be best is for me to have some chocolate in the house and just have a little bit every evening before I go to bed. But I know myself, and that's not going to happen. And so I make sure that there's just no chocolate in the house at all. It seems like when I go to the grocery store and buy other things but no chocolate, I'm engaging in self-paternalism. I am, as it were, protecting my future self from his entirely predictable weakness of will in the face of chocolate in the house. So that's it seems like a kind of self-paternalism. Or suppose that I decide to quit smoking, but I know how hard it is to quit smoking, and so I want to raise the stakes. So I post on Facebook telling all my friends that I hereby quit smoking. And what I do by that is it's a kind of a threat, a credible threat of future self-shaming. Right? I know now that if I start smoking again, all my friends will be disappointed and so on. Not a nice experience for me. So here too what I do is, if I had full confidence and full trust in the rationality and strength of will of my future self, I would need to do that because it is of course imprudent to smoke. But knowing something about my own entirely predictable failures, I engage in self-paternalizing my future self. Again, some people think that self-paternalizing as paternalism is no paternalism at all, and once again, we don't care about definitions. It seems to me that the case of self-paternalism does give rise to at least some of the same normatively relevant phenomena as more standard cases of paternalism, so it's worth thinking about here. But whether at the end of the day you're willing to label it paternalism is really of little interest. Okay, so here's our next topic, and now we're trying to be better on diagnosis and argumentation. We're trying to understand why it is that paternalism, roughly understood in the way sketched here, why it is that paternalism is at least morally suspicious, at least calls for justification, if it ever is justified. The first thing to note here is that paternalistic intervention is intervention for the person with whom we are interfering, right? That's what makes it paternalism. So it's hard not to view the suspicion vis-a-vis paternalism with some suspicion in its own right. Worse things have happened than intervention by the state or by other people in order to benefit the person intervened with. But still there's something going on that's morally suspicious. So we need to say more. And one thought here, developed by Jonathan Kwong, whose picture you can see right there, is that at least a part of the problem of paternalistic intervention involves judgment or belief. So in cases of paternalism, what does the paternalizing think or believe of the paternalized? It seems like all of these cases involve what may be thought of very loosely as a problematic judgment of sorts. In order to paternalize me, say by hiding the chocolate, you have to think that either I'm not smart enough to understand that it's not good for me to have the chocolate, or that I'm smart enough but too weak-willed, or that maybe I'm practically irrational in some other way. And Kwong's initial thought is that there's something problematic in believing this about other people. Such beliefs, at the very least, are not the nicest thing you can believe of another person. Perhaps they're also offensive in some way. So I think Kwong certainly is onto something important that happens in many cases of paternalism. A problematic judgment is involved. But I don't think that you get the kind of result he wants. You don't get the moral suspicion vis-a-vis paternalism as easily as all that. That's because the judgment, say that I am unlikely to stop myself from having that extra piece of chocolate or whatever, that judgment is either supported by the evidence or not. Or perhaps we can go more gradual here. We can talk about how strongly it's supported by the evidence. Now, if it's not sufficiently supported by the evidence, if my wife believes that I will succumb to temptation without any evidence that I will, perhaps just because she, doesn't think that highly of me in general, well, in that case, of course, it's morally problematic. But then it's morally problematic partly because it's epistemically problematic. It's just problematic as a matter of reasons for belief. Why would she believe this of me if there is not enough evidence? In that case, you don't need to go moral and you don't need to discuss paternalism. The problem is that she believes something of me without sufficient evidential support. So the interesting case is the case in which the evidence does support the judgment, as it does in the case of the chocolate. The evidence overwhelmingly supports my wife's judgment that I will succumb once again to chocolate temptation. So now the question is, in that case, in the case in which the evidence supports the judgment, isn't that what my wife should believe of me? Shouldn't she believe, in this case, as in all others, in accordance with the evidence? Does it even seem plausible that morality can constrain what we should believe at all? It seems like morality can constrain things in the vicinity. For instance, clearly morality has something to say about how we are allowed and how we are not allowed to gather evidence, say, or perhaps some other restrictions on our, let's call them, epistemic related practices. But about what we should believe, given a body of evidence, it seems like morality is silent. It's epistemology doing the work here. It's about what is best supported by the evidence. So if the evidence best supports the claim that I will have too much chocolate, that is the thing to believe. Is it ever rational to believe against evidence just because of moral considerations? So if it's more virtuous not to succumb to chocolate temptation, can it be that what my wife ought to believe of me that I won't, even though the evidence supports very clearly the judgment that I will? That sounds at least problematic. It's especially problematic when the evidence doesn't just support the relevant problematic judgment, but overwhelmingly does, as it does in many of the cases we've talked about. My wife knows as clearly and surely as she knows anything that I will once again succumb to chocolate temptation. And the state knows, everyone here knows, you now know, that people will tend to very strongly undersave for retirement if left to their own devices. The evidence is in, and it's very, very clear. So it seems very hard to think that morality can somehow oppose the strength of evidence vis-a-vis judgments. It may have influences on what we should do, but that is different, right? It's quite possible that we shouldn't act on certain beliefs. I'll get to that in a second. But it seems like what we should believe is just a matter of the evidence. Now, there is more that can be said here, of course. One of the things that we could pursue here are broader questions about the relations between what's sometimes called the practical and the epistemic, or between reasons for actions, roughly, and reasons for belief, right? Because, as I just said, perhaps it's one thing to ask what my wife should believe in with regard to my chocolate resistance tendencies. It's another to ask what she should do about them. So interactions between reasons to believe and reasons for action are very much on the scene here. And you may recall that we already had some initial discussion of such relations. We had them when we discussed statistical evidence, for instance. So this is a major topic, a much more general topic that comes up here as well. I just want to flag it. It involves more general, more abstract considerations that are farther away from our main topic today, and indeed in this course. But these are general issues that are involved in the discussion, for instance, with Kwong here. So again, perhaps the problem is not with a judgment. Perhaps the problem is not with a judgment that people will tend to irrationally undersave for retirement, or that I will tend to eat too much chocolate. Perhaps the judgment is okay because it's supported by the evidence, but the action may still be problematic because of considerations having to do with paternalism. That's a possible way to go. Indeed, I think that's my way of going here. But you still owe us a story, because at least the default position is that you should act on the beliefs that are best supported by your evidence. That may not be true across the board in full generality, but it does seem to be the default position, right? Suppose you are wondering whether to take an umbrella or not. Suppose you're justified in believing it's going to rain. Then you should take an umbrella because you're justified in believing that it's going to rain. Your actions, it seems like they derive their justificatory status from the justificatory status of the beliefs. So to combine the claim that my wife should believe that I'm going to overeat, but should not act on that belief, these two claims together, that's a possible way to go, but it requires a justification. Why is it that she's not justified in acting on the justified belief that I will overeat the chocolate? That doesn't mean that we can't fill in the details here. The problem, though, is that when we try to fill in the details, we may be back at square one. Really, what we're asking now is what's problematic with paternalistic intervention. And so the Kwong kind of story about trying to focus on the judgment, on the problematic judgment that's involved in cases of paternalism, it seems to me, does not do the required work here. So we need another kind of answer to the question: what's problematic about paternalism? What's morally suspicious about paternalistic intervention? And here you may be you may feel a kind of healthy epistemic modesty, because at least when it comes to cases in the real world, as opposed to cleaned up hypothetical cases in philosophy textbooks, say, and in some legal ones too. When we discuss real world cases, then instrumental considerations clearly apply. So perhaps, for instance, political authorities are really not as good at determining what's good for people as many people in positions of power seem to think. Perhaps even spouses aren't that great in determining, say, how much chocolate their spouse is best, it would be best for their spouse to eat, as they seem to think. If that's true, if people in positions of power tend to overestimate their abilities to know what's good for people, then you may think that it's a good idea to restrict their paternalistic interventions because of such considerations. It's possible also that paternalistic interventions will have other problematic consequences. And certainly such intervention has costs, but maybe it has other problematic consequences as well. They may have a problematic educational aspect. So think about the kind of parental advice that says that, you should allow your kids to make mistakes because that's the only way they will learn. So we don't think that that's always true. If they're about to make a fatal mistake, you should intervene paternalistically. But at least for some mistake, it does seem like sensible advice. It's worth, as it were, to suffer a minor loss now, even if it involves, a very minor injury. You may want to let them, just in order to avoid the more serious injuries that will surely come in the future if they don't learn to do things by themselves. So there may be political versions of this too. This comes up sometimes in discussing the intricate relations between different political institutions. To what extent do you want to correct mistakes, or to what extent do you want them to deal with those mistakes themselves, and so on. So there may be, broadly speaking, educational reasons that make paternalistic intervention, at least sometimes, problematic. There may be other considerations of this kind, other instrumental considerations as well. Still, they don't seem to do everything we want here for the following reasons. So obviously, if we're going to go instrumental, then the considerations become extremely contingent and empirical. From the armchair, you can merely speculate one way or another. You really need empirical evidence about which kind of interventions are likely to have which kind of effects. And so you're going to get a kind of really context-sensitive answer to the question whether there's a problem with a paternalistic intervention. That's a problem if what you want is a clear philosophical, wide scope kind of generalization. But I just want to note, maybe we shouldn't. That shouldn't be our aim anyway. We're doing politics here. It's quite possible that the thing to do is to remain extremely pragmatic, context-sensitive, and settle for particular truth rather than sweeping generalizations. Also, even if it is true that specific paternalistic intervention, or maybe paternalism more generally, has serious costs, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't engage in it. In order to know whether we should engage in it, we should check whether its costs are worth it. So we should compare the costs to all the benefit that can be achieved by paternalistic intervention. And there's quite a lot of benefit that may be achieved. Just think about the case of undersaving for retirement. We know something about people. They're not that impressive. They can be very weak-willed, extremely stupid, very irrational, and so wise paternalistic intervention can do a lot of good. It can certainly prevent a lot of harm. So merely pointing to the costs of paternalistic intervention is not enough. We need to show that these costs are much more serious than the benefits, and that will involve more either by way of armchair speculation or by way of empirical research, but anyway, it doesn't seem to me that the answer is clear. Anyway, as I said, we are going to be assuming most of these complications away because we are working from the armchair. So the question now becomes, is there anything morally suspicious with paternalism other than possibly instrumental considerations depending on the relevant contingent empirical data? So here's another kind of attempt, and a really plausible one. At this point, it should sound familiar to you because we've mentioned the value of autonomy more than once in this course already. The thought is to repeat roughly that there is value to be had in being the driver of one's own life car, or being the person who writes on his or her own, to an extent at least, one's life story, being the one in charge of one's life, rather than being driven by circumstances or by just following a guru or something along these lines. So it's important to be shaping one's own life with one's own choices according to one's own conception of the good. It's at least a value. It's not necessarily the only value, of course, but it's at least a value. Well, if autonomy is a value, then paternalism at least has a price, even independently of possible instrumental considerations. It has a price because certainly paradigmatic cases of paternalistic intervention, and maybe any case of paternalistic intervention, pays a price in autonomy. When my wife hides the chocolate, she doesn't exactly restrict my liberty, and she does it for me, so worse things have happened, but she's not in full respect of my autonomy while she does that. She takes charge over my life, a small part of it, but still. Even in cases in which the paternalistic intervention is otherwise flawless, there is always a price in terms of the paternalized's autonomy. But now things get tricky, both because autonomy is not transparent, there's more to be said there, and also because we need more details about the ways in which a paternalistic intervention may be in tension with autonomy. So let's start with two distinctions in the literature. Again, this is just going to be helpful terminology, but the distinctions are important, as you'll see. It is sometimes, the distinction is sometimes offered between what's called hard and soft paternalism. And that distinction hangs on whether the paternalistic intervention is restricted to failures of rationality or full information, or whether it's not so restricted. So you're a soft paternalist if you think that many cases of paternalism are justified, so long as the paternalistic intervention is meant to deal with, say, absence of information or with temporary failure of rationality. One good example here again comes from John Stuart Mill. It's the example of someone who's about to walk on a bridge that, unbeknownst to him, will not carry his weight. And so you may want to explain to him that the bridge will not carry his weight, but maybe you don't speak the same language. So you're waiting for the interpreter to arrive on the scene. And Mill says, quite plausibly, until the interpreter is there, you can restrain them. This is, of course, the case of a paternalistic intervention. It's quite serious. It involves actually holding them down, right? But it is, in other respects, less serious, because you're just doing it temporarily until they get the information that they badly need in order to make their own decision. So that's a case of a soft paternalistic intervention. But you are a hard paternalist if you think that at least sometimes paternalism is justified, even when there isn't just a problem of a temporary ignorance or maybe a temporary irrationality. And now that we've talked in terms of autonomy, it seems very clear that, at least in general, the value of autonomy is more at stake in cases of hard paternalism than soft paternalism. So when the man on the bridge, you may be thinking to yourself, I'm not harming their autonomy when I'm holding them down. I'm actually improving their chances of making their own lives, because I prevent from them a mistake that's based just on ignorance. And in a few minutes, the interpreter is going to show up on the scene, and then they can continue autonomously from there. Cases of hard paternalism seem to be at least harder to justify in terms of the cost in autonomy. I just want to note, as I said, it's not entirely clear how to understand the value of autonomy. We may need more details about the value of autonomy in order to say just how problematic cases of hard paternalism really are. Okay, so that's the first distinction, hard and soft paternalism. The second one is often labeled strong and weak paternalism. And here the distinction hangs on whether the intervention is needed to promote the paternalized's own ends or not necessarily so. So here's an example. Suppose you know that it's very important for me to keep kosher. And now there's a dish that just smells wonderful, but is not kosher. We can use a Seinfeld example. There's an omelet that contains some lobster. Lobster, as it happens, is not kosher. Suppose you take the dish away from me, or you somehow prevent me from having that lobster omelet. in that case, you are clearly intervening in some way. You are clearly paternalizing me, right? You're doing it for my own good. But you're doing it for my own good based on my own aims. You know that it's really important for me to keep kosher, and you're intervening in a way that will help me, perhaps in the face of weakness of will, live up to my own aims. Again, this is already some imposition on my autonomy, but it's not quite as serious as the following case. Suppose that I am, in some sense, Jewish, but I don't keep kosher and I don't care either. And yet you take away the lobster omelet. Well, in that case, you are still doing it for me, or so we may be assuming. You're doing it because you think that it's bad for me as a Jew not to keep kosher. So the intervention is still paternalistic. But it's strongly paternalistic in precisely this sense now. It's not an aim that I have to keep kosher. You are imposing the aim on me, not just the means to the relevant end. And you're imposing that on me from a paternalistic motivation, for my own good. So once again, it seems clear that the price in terms of autonomy is higher, at least in general, in cases of strong paternalism compared to cases of weak paternalism. Now, none of this means that we can never justify cases of strong paternalism or hard paternalism, or even cases of strong, hard paternalism. It just means that more will be needed in order to justify such cases. Perhaps more harm will be needed to be prevented in this way in order to justify such paternalistic interventions. Does nudging impose on one's autonomy? So when you put the salad roughly at the height of my eye so that I eat more healthy, are you intervening or are you taking charge of my life, as it were? Are you making it harder for me to be the driver in my life's car? That's actually a tricky question. We'll get to say more on that shortly. Okay, a little bit more on paternalism and autonomy. Here's a distinction that you may recognize from other discussions as well in this course and elsewhere. You may think of autonomy here merely as a value, roughly something to be promoted, so that your life is better to the extent, at least other things being equal, your life is better to the extent that they're autonomous. Or you may think of autonomy as also a right, perhaps something very closely related to a deontological constraint. So let me just very quickly remind you what these are. To say that something is a value is to say that it's good, that a state of affairs is better with it than without it, at least when other things are equal. To say that there is a right here means that we shouldn't offend against someone's autonomy, at least sometimes, even in order to get a better state of affairs. Right? That's what rights do. They sometimes function as trumps, as it were, against general considerations of perhaps well-being or perhaps the public good. So when we say that autonomy is of value in contexts that are relevant to paternalism, do we just mean that it's a value, that a life is better when it's autonomous, when other things are equal? Or do we mean something stronger than that? Well, let's see. If we think of autonomy merely as of value, then all you need in order to justify a paternalistic intervention is to show that there is more value, as it were, on the other side or on the other scale. Well, that would be especially clear in cases in which the value on the other side will also be the value of autonomy. So here's one interesting thing about brain injuries suffered from riding on motorcycles without helmets. They compromise the rider's future autonomy in very serious ways, as does having lung cancer and so on. So if you can, as it were, earn more points, more autonomy points, by prohibiting riding a motorcycle without a helmet, or by making smoking exceptionally expensive because of your taxation scheme. And if autonomy is just a matter of value, then there should be no problem here at all. You are just trading in values. You're getting more value and paying with less. So that shouldn't be problematic at all. There is no principled problem according to this picture. According to the picture of autonomy as merely a value here. No problem at all in intervention that's meant to protect the paternalized's own future autonomy. No problem at all. I want to submit the claim that that's not plausible. Even if it's true that your future autonomy is served by me not allowing you to ride a motorcycle without a helmet, that doesn't make such a criminal prohibition unproblematic. It maybe make it justified at the end of the day, but there is a problem in terms of your autonomy going on here. Similarly for other things, if I make boxing illegal, as some people say we should, because of its terrible health effects on the people who do it with consent, let us assume, I am protecting their future autonomy, but it's not like I'm not hurting their autonomy. I am not fully respecting their autonomy at the moment of intervention. And what that means is that we should not think of autonomy here as relevant merely as a value, merely as something to be promoted, something that makes a life go better. We should think about it as at least in the vicinity of a deontological constraint. That means that people have a right that their autonomy not be interfered with, at least in some cases. That means that the state has a duty not to interfere with their autonomy, so that paternalism is not just suspicious, but sometimes goes against duty. That doesn't mean that that duty is absolute. So as we know from general discussions of deontology, the fact that there's a deontological constraint against paternalistic intervention does not mean that no considerations can ever outweigh it. Some can. Deontological constraints are certainly not necessarily absolute. What it does mean, though, is that it's not just a matter of, say, net value, or the balance of how much value, the value of autonomy or other values you get by intervening compared to how much you lose. It's not that. It's more complicated than that. And at least a consideration remains, even if the paternalistic intervention is efficient, say, in terms of the value of autonomy.